Lord Owen, if we look back to 1979, now there are many historians, commentators and so on who now see it as a great watershed in British politics, the beginning of a new era, but I wonder, did it feel that way on that day in May 1979?
I was mainly thrilled to have won my seat. I mean, it was a tough election, and at the start of the campaign it looked as if the Conservatives might win by even a larger amount than they did. I think Jim Callaghan fought a brave and serious campaign, but in his heart of hearts he knew that we were heading for defeat. And I think that in a strange way it was in the tea leaves, if you like. It was inevitable after the winter of discontent, when Jim Callaghan wasn't able and decided not to challenge the trade unions. It was inevitable. There was going to be a change of leadership, and there was going to have to be a trade union reform. And I think the country knew that. Mrs. Thatcher knew that, although she took quite a time, really, before the full trade union reforms came through. It was not until really after the miners' strike that the issue of the trade unions was settled.
She said on that morning, when she stood outside number 10, she said, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony." And some have thought, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, that was an odd thing to say, given the fact that actually she did need to be quite tough, as you've suggested, on the issue of trade unions.
When she came in, she was still not totally accepted by quite a number of the senior figures in her cabinet. I think she had not resolved her prime ministership, her stance, if you like. And I think it was really not until the Falklands had been invaded that we saw the real Thatcher prime ministership begin. It's very interesting that in 1981 there was a threat of a miners' strike. Jo Gormley was then the leader of the NUM. She looked at the situation, unemployment was rising, she and the government were not very popular, and she decided to pay up. But the difference in her style of leadership is that she knew Arthur Scargill was coming in after Jo Gormley. She knew there would be a confrontation, and she started to prepare for it. So the miners' strike, when it came in 1984, the government were ready. But in 1981, they weren't ready. And so the lady is for turning. The lady is not absolutely adamant at this stage, nor at some other stages. And at this particular crucial moment, she was prepared to compromise, to live to fight another day, but to develop the coal stocks and to be ready for what she knew was an inevitable confrontation with Arthur Scargill.
That actually, although, as you say, it shows it wasn't true the lady was not for turning, it does show that she did think strategically. She had real leadership skills.
Yes, I think there's no doubt that she did. And she also, during the miners' strike, deliberately did not use the new trade union legislation. And at one stage, actually, I argued that she should use it. I supported her as leader of the SDP throughout the miners' strike. It was an absolutely crucial strike. It had to be won, and it could not end with a draw. This one couldn't end with somehow each side claiming victory. Arthur Scargill actually had to be defeated. If that had not happened, then we would never have had the transformation in industrial relations and the improvement in industrial performance and the overall improvement in our economy that came right through the 90s and is still with us today.
When you look at her record on the economy, if you compare what the economy was like in 79 and what it was like in 90, you believe there was a transformation?
I think it took some time in coming. I mean, after all, they came in and broke an electoral pledge immediately and raised VAT, doubled VAT virtually. And that came as a shock to many. It was the right decision. Also, she and Geoffrey Howe, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I think he has to be given credit for this, held public expenditure down and saw unemployment rise and became very unpopular. But that was also a necessary part of getting resources and investment into economic growth and into new investment in industry. So it was a deliberate attempt to switch the economy away from public sector emphasis and orientation towards a market economy. And then that came through in other changes. Privatization was not even talked about at that time. Privatization hadn't really been thought through. Privatization came later. but that was another necessary underpinning. But the monetary discipline that came right from the start, that was, in my view, an essential. It had frankly started already, monetary discipline, under Dennis Healey and the IMF and under Jim Callaghan. And like all these things, that no credit is given to your predecessors by an incoming government. But Labour had governed economically very badly, in my view, from 74 until 76. But when Callaghan came in and took control of the IMF negotiations, he and Dennis Healey started the economic recovery, which now Tony Blair's benefiting from. So there's more continuity to history than political parties are ready to give credit to.
You mentioned the public sector. The public sector, the welfare, there was a consensus in politics, was there not, up until 79, amongst the parties about the role of the public sector, the welfare state. Did she change our attitudes quite fundamentally to the public sector and the welfare state?
I don't think so. I think it's one of the myths. In fact, spending on health service continued quite high through most of her period, and there wasn't very much of a fall-off in education either. I mean, what she did neglect, and we've seen of considerable consequence, which she wasn't the first government, and Labour governments had, was neglect of the infrastructure of society, the failure to invest in the railway system, in the public structures, if you like. That we had been neglecting for a long time. And as a consequence, if you look in the continent of Europe, the railway system is far superior to us. Their road construction program is far more advanced. And that does allow them greater efficiencies in industry. And we haven't improved our productivity. Even now, with better growth than the European economies, our productivity levels are often still lower, and there's a lot more that needs to be done to make our economy a really effective competitor with the United States.
How do you assess, just turning now away from the domestic agenda, how do you assess her performance with regard to Britain's role in the world, particularly from the Falklands War through to the end of her reign?
Well, when Lord Carrington stepped down, I think, honourably and correctly, she became her own Foreign Secretary, and she never really gave up that position from then on, shades of Tony Blair now. And she did centralise some foreign policy, making in number 10, but of course nothing to the extent that we've seen under Tony Blair. But the crucial test for her was the Falklands. In many ways, she had been neglectful on her watch. It should not have happened. It should not have happened, but once it happened, she showed an iron resolution, and she was a good war leader. And she knew at one stage, when a compromise looked possible, that it wasn't real, it wasn't for real. And she went right through and confronted, at various stages, President Reagan. The defense secretary at the time was very helpful in the United States, but Reagan himself was split a bit, wanting to keep good relations with South America, the traditional American position. So that was very effective. And at this stage, too, she was very much fighting for Britain's interests over the financial budget, which had been coming awry for quite some time. Again, she inherited a position negotiated by the previous Labour government, by myself as Foreign Secretary and Jim Callaghan and Dennis Healey. But she did deliver it, and she held out, and these were good things. The anti-Europeanism really began to be louder from 86, 87, 88. And of course, by then she was in the grip of hubris. And as always happens, nemesis comes later. And the last 2 years of her prime ministership, she was too autocratic, she wasn't listening, she thought she knew it all, and she was getting more and more alienated from her party. And as always happens under the system, the party reasserted, and Parliament reasserted, control of the Prime Minister, who was out of control.
Do you think there's a tendency on the part of some to overestimate the role she played during that last decade of the Cold War, which resulted in victory for parliamentary democracy over communism? Did she really play quite a crucial role, along with Reagan and to some extent Bush?
She held firm on the need for the NATO to accept the Pershing missile deployment and cruise missiles. But she had other European allies, and of course the Americans. That was a very necessary decision, and the left in Europe was out to lunch, not just here in the Labour Party, but also in many other European countries. And that was a very important part of... But détente, again, under Willy Brandt, and over many years it played its part in the fall of the Berlin Wall. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Thatcher's biggest foreign policy mistake was to object to the reunification of Germany, and she put herself absolutely out of kilter with the then Chancellor Kohl and also President Bush Sr. And it was a folly. It lasted for about 3 or 4 weeks. She thought Mitterrand, who often mused privately that it would be better to keep East Germany and West Germany and not have reintegration. But of course he wasn't going to say that publicly, and France went with Germany, and Britain was very isolated. So our foreign policy record is a mixed one. It wasn't brilliant, but it was firm on defence, which was very necessary at that time, firm on nuclear strategic negotiations when Reagan was rather tempted at one stage to fall for Gorbachev's position of giving up nuclear weapons, and she knew that was a foolish position. So I give it a mixed performance. I don't believe she was a great Prime Minister in foreign policy. I think that her greatness must lie in understanding that we had to have a market economy, we had to reform our industrial relations, and it's an economic record which overall was extremely successful and very necessary and rather painful.
What is her lasting legacy?
I think her lasting legacy is the longest sustainable period of economic growth this country has probably ever had. And I think it had to be a recognition that you've got to earn your keep in the marketplaces of the world, and that we could no longer go on with the rather soft options on economic reform and industrial relations reform that successive governments, Conservative and Labour, had gone on with from the 1950s. In this sense, she was a very radical leader. And she was lucky. We had a Labour opposition, which was really hopeless from 81, I would say, until really 1994. But it's certainly very bad during all of her prime ministership. And she was supported by the one new force that came into British politics, which was the Social Democratic Party, on industrial relations reform, the miners' strike, and having a firm defence policy. So she had a broader consensus. And this was shown in the opinion polls. There were quite a large period of the reforming period of Margaret Thatcher's government when the Conservatives weren't even in the lead. The SDP Liberal Alliance was in the lead. And for most of those policies, we were supportive.